December 14, 1942, the gigantic six-engine Soviet aircraft PS-124 takes off from the Charjov airport and heads towards its destination point located in the city of Tashkent. On board the aircraft are 10 crew members, 26 passengers, and 5 tons of various cargo. The flight carries on normally for 2 hours when all of a sudden the aircraft goes into a deep dive and crashes into the ground, killing all those on board. I'm sure most of you have never heard either of this accident or the Soviet PS-124 aircraft, which is a bit surprising given the fact that back then the PS-124 was technically the largest land-based passenger aircraft in the world. But if I tell you the PS-124's original designation, which the aircraft carried up until 1937, things may start becoming clearer. It was the Tupolev ANT-20 bis, the lesser-known twin brother of the once largest aircraft in the world, the infamous ANT-20 Maxim Gorky. The fact of the gigantic PS-124's downfall is itself worth this story, but it is the details of the investigation report that make the crash of the PS-124 arguably one of the strangest and most ridiculous accidents in Russian aviation history. According to the report, at the moment of the crash, the captain of the aircraft was missing from the cockpit and was found in the passenger cabin, completely naked. When speaking about aviation accidents, it's hard to feel anything but sorrow, since it's lost human lives that we are talking about. And yet, when reading the details of the PS-124 crash in 1942, I can't help but think about the movie Airplane. I simply can't imagine what was going on board the PS-124 during its last flight. I mean, I can, but YouTube once again will age-restrict my video. And it's not just some regular airplane that we are talking about here, but a unique machine which up until June 1941 held the title of the largest aircraft in the world, while in its own subcategory of land-based transport aircraft, its dimensions remained unbeaten until 1947. So how come no one remembers the PS-124? In September 1932, the Soviet Union celebrated the 40th anniversary of the literary career of the great proletarian writer Maxim Gorky. As a gift to the writer, the renowned Soviet journalist Mikhail Koltsov, who was favored by Stalin, proposed the construction of the world's largest airplane, which would bear the name of Maxim Gorky. The airplane was intended to become the flagship of a special propaganda squadron which would promote the goals and achievements of Soviet communism. To build the aircraft, a nationwide fundraising campaign was launched, and in a little over a year, 6 million rubles were collected, which at the time was a significant amount. The task of manufacturing the airplane was assigned to Andrei Tupolev, who had previously designed heavy all-metal aircraft such as the Soviet TB-1 and TB-3 bombers. On June 17, 1934, the new plane, designated as ANT-20 Maxim Gorky, made its first flight. For its time, the Maxim Gorky was indeed in every way an exceptional aircraft. And of course, the Russians quickly started using it as a prominent symbol of the exceptional achievements of the young communist country, which, however, was quite soon destroyed in such a dumb way. The aircraft, I mean, not the communist country, unfortunately. On May 18, 1935, during one of the demonstration flights, a small fighter aircraft performing loop maneuvers around the Maxim Gorky accidentally struck the wing of the flying giant. What was supposed to become great footage for a propaganda film ended up with 49 people dead. Of course, for Soviet Russia, the main tragedy was not the loss of life, but the loss of the symbolic aircraft. Unfortunately, the Russians' favorite method of dealing with problems, to cover up the crash and pretend the plane and people didn't exist at all, wouldn't work this time, since the Russians themselves had been showing off the ANT-20 to the world on every possible occasion. Thus, the Russians decided to rebuild the ANT-20, and not just one, but 16 of them. Once again, a national fundraiser was announced, and in less than 2 months after the ANT-20 crash, 68 million rubles had been collected from kind-hearted Soviet citizens. It's a bit hard to explain how impressive that amount was, since the Soviet ruble had never been a convertible currency. What can help us are these two little articles from the 1936 Pravda newspaper, stating that back in 1936 you could buy one shovel for 1 ruble and 45 kopecks, an axe for 2.5 rubles, and a metal bucket for almost 6.5 rubles. While the second article says that for only 590 rubles you could buy a trip to Altai, located in Siberia. So in the matter of purchasing power, the collected 68 million rubles could buy almost 47 million shovels, or 10.5 million metal buckets, or more than 115,000 trips to Altai. In other words, it was an impressive amount collected to build the new planes, for which the Soviet government had already chosen and approved the names. The first airplane was supposed to be named Vladimir Lenin, the next one of course was Joseph Stalin, the third aircraft was intended to be named Maxim Gorky once again. The rest of the planes were to carry the names of other Soviet heroes and leaders, whether still living or resting in peace. Although the original Maxim Gorky was a propaganda airplane, a sort of flying community center, all 16 new aircraft from the very beginning were meant to serve in civil aviation. However, no one in the government had thought about how the gigantic airplanes would be serviced and operated. At that time, when Soviet civil aviation carried only high-ranking officials and work-related travelers, the profitability of large-capacity airliners was highly questionable. At the same time, the squadron of multi-engine monsters would definitely create numerous problems, requiring large airfields with long runways, as well as special equipment for refueling and maintenance. But all those silly capitalist nuances could never stop true communists. So on August 4, 1935, by the order of the Labor and Defense Council, the construction of 16 new aircraft was assigned to the aviation factory in Kazan. The fact that the construction of the factory had not yet been completed was no obstacle for true communists either. The work of designing the new Giants was entrusted to the same team that created the Maxim Gorky, the TAG engineers led by Andrei Tupolev. However, at the time they were occupied with other important and urgent communist tasks, such as building the new SB high-speed bomber. But true communist silly nuances, all that stuff. According to calculations by the Labor and Defense Council, the cost of one new aircraft designated as the NT-20 bis was estimated at 510,000 rubles, and in August 1935, by a special order, the Council allocated 20.5 million rubles for the construction of the 16 aircraft. I know that some of you may notice some discrepancies here in the numbers between the funds raised and allocated. However, questioning this kind of nuances in the USSR back then would most likely result not in true but dead communists, or at the very least an extended trip to Altai, which is why, with no questions asked, the building of the new giant aircraft happily began. Despite the grandiose start of the campaign to build the giant new Soviet aircraft, the assembly process appeared to be very slow. A shortage of skilled personnel at the new Kazan factory led to slow preparations for production, and by December 1, 1935, only about half of the required drafts and drawings were ready. Meanwhile, the necessary machinery had not arrived at all. Similar to the crushed Maxim Gorky, the new NT-20 bis was supposed to have a dual purpose, namely the ability to be quickly converted into either a heavy bomber or transport aircraft in case of war. However, in reality, due to various difficulties, all of this remained only on the blueprints, and the NT-20 bis was being built as a purely civilian aircraft. Overall, the construction process was constantly slowed down for multiple reasons. In 1937, when construction of the wings and fuselage was finally completed and assembly had just started, the roof of the workshop all of a sudden collapsed due to a heavy winter snow. Those silly new factory construction nuances. Fortunately, the aircraft was not damaged, but it had to be disassembled and transported to a new workshop. However, the completion of the task was yet again delayed. Initially, the NT-20 bis was designed with strength limits according to the 1934 standards, but in 1937 stricter standards were introduced, so the requirements for the aircraft design had to be revised several times, while some parts of the aircraft had to be redone from scratch. The most significant factor that contributed to the construction delay was Stalin's repressions. The journalist Koltsov, who had come up with the idea of building the giant aircraft, was arrested and later executed, just like the head of the Tsagi Nikolai Kharlamov. Also arrested was Boris Sauky, the Tsagi chief designer who supervised the Anti-20 construction at the Kazan factory. Soon the same fate befell Andrei Tupolev himself. All in all, many workers from both Tsagi and the aviation industry ended up in prisons and labor camps. Since the construction of the multi-engine Giant was proceeding very slowly, to ease the burden, the Soviet government reduced the total number of aircraft to be built from 16 to 5, and not only abandoned the installation of any military equipment, but even the plans for its future installation. Since the designation ANT stood for Andrei Tupolev's initials, with his arrest, the aircraft now received the neutral designation PS-124, which simply stood for Passenger Plane Number 124. Responsibility for its construction was now dropped on Joseph Nezval, who soon arrived in Kazan. But for him, Giant aircraft was also an unwanted burden, since his main task at Kazan was starting production of the new 4-engine heavy bomber TB-7. By now, the PS-124 was causing problems for everyone. Therefore, the leadership decided to complete the construction of only one aircraft as quickly as possible and forget about the rest. All mentions of the 16 Air Giants and their intended names disappeared. No one likes to speak about their failures. On top of that, some of the intended names belonged to people who had already gone from being communist heroes to enemies of the state. The only reminder of the grand venture was just one completed PS-124, which made its first flight on May 15, 1939. In comparison to its predecessor, the PS-124 primarily differed by the absence of the over-fuselage engines. Instead, 6 new, slightly more powerful engines were installed. The shape of the tail had also changed, as well as the nose section, which became a bit longer and housed one of the passenger cabins. Interestingly, the navigator's seat was also located there, not separated in any way from the passengers, making it possibly the first and only case of open workspace in aviation. In addition to the cabin in the nose, there were 2 more passenger cabins in the fuselage, as well as 4 compartments located within the central part of the wings. Overall, the aircraft could accommodate a total of 64 passengers, for whose convenience there were comfortable seats, a few cloakrooms, 2 toilets, which was rare for aircraft of the time, as well as a restaurant with a kitchen. In August 1939, the PS-124 completed state trials and was put into operation. Starting in the autumn of 1939, the PS-124 performed regular flights on the route Moscow-Kharkiv-Rostov-Mineralnye Vody. The aircraft operated on this route until the beginning of the following winter, but not very intensively. It only completed 26 flights and carried just over 2,000 passengers. With the onset of winter, the PS-124 was parked at Vnukovo Airport near Moscow. It appeared that operation of the aircraft had proven to be excessively expensive, even for a communist country where profitability of airlines was never considered of any priority. The PS-124 stood idle in the open air for a whole year, up until the outbreak of war. The Soviet army urgently needed as many transport planes as possible, and that's when they remembered the parked aircraft. In the sky above Moscow, the giant clumsy plane could become an easy prey for German Messerschmitt, so in November 1941 the aircraft was moved away from the front to the Uzbek Soviet Republic. The PS-124 was then stationed in Tashkent and used on local routes, mostly transporting various cargo. Here the aircraft was operated more intensively than before. The average monthly flight time was almost twice as much as achieved while in Moscow. However, this didn't last for long, just a little over a year. On December 12, 1942, the PS-124 took off, as it turned out, on its final flight. On December 14, 1942, at 11:40 a.m., the PS-124, piloted by Captain Gavyaz and co-pilot Trapkov, took off from Charjovo airfield and headed for Tashkent. On board the aircraft were 5.5 tons of various cargo, 26 passengers and 10 crew members. The weather on the route was good and there were no reported technical issues with the plane. The route was well known to the pilots as they had flown it many times in both directions. At 1:50 p.m. at an altitude of about 500 meters, the aircraft began to descend. Initially the descent was smooth, but then the angle of descent started to increase more and more. Soon the plane entered a steep dive and with an angle of about 80 degrees crashed into the ground 90 kilometers southwest of Tashkent. All passengers and crew on board were killed. The crash was not followed by fire, which significantly facilitated the investigation of the crash. According to the investigation report, the crash resulted in a crater filled with the wreckage of the aircraft. The first thing noticed by the investigation team was the unusual position of the trimmable horizontal stabilizer, which was set for a dive at the moment of the crash. The second shocking detail evaded investigators in the remains of the cockpit, where two bodies were found: the co-pilot Trapkov and, in the captain's seat, the body of a passenger with the last name Kozlov. The captain's body was missing in the cockpit. Meanwhile, in the remains of the passenger cabin, next to the identified corpse of one of the passengers, the body of a man was found, which, as stated in the investigation report, was completely naked. The extent of the damage prevented verification of his identity, but a document belonging to Captain Gavyaz was found next to the body, so the investigation assumed it could be no one other than the captain. Based on the collected details, the investigation concluded that Captain Gavyaz had allowed passenger Kozlov, who was also a pilot but had no experience flying multi-engine aircraft, to take control of the PS-124. At the same time, Captain Gavyaz had left the cockpit for an unknown reason, which, according to witnesses, had happened repeatedly on previous flights. Eyewitness testimony revealed that Captain Gavyaz had previously allowed Comrade Kozlov, as well as two other passengers, to operate the PS-124. Comrade Kozlov, either accidentally or to test the aircraft's reaction to a change in the stabilizer angle, had activated the electronic mechanism for the trimmable stabilizer located on the captain's armrest. This operation set the stabilizer to the maximum dive angle. When in flight, setting the stabilizer to the maximum angle would inevitably push the aircraft into a steep dive, making it impossible to pull the aircraft back to level flight using the manual controls. Comrade Kozlov was unable to deactivate the stabilizer mechanism in time, as he did not have a clear understanding of how to operate it. The co-pilot also failed to deactivate the mechanism, and as a result, the aircraft entered such a steep dive that it was impossible to recover. And this is how the giant twin brother of the infamous Anti-20 Maxim Gorky met its demise, in a tragedy as absurd and ridiculous as its predecessors, only this time caused not by one pilot's recklessness, but due to the aircraft captain's extreme negligence and irresponsibility. Of course, neither the investigation team nor anyone else could find an answer as to why the captain had left the cockpit, leaving one of the passengers at the controls. Also remaining unanswered was the question as to why the co-pilot, although sitting right next to Comrade Kozlov, hadn't supervised his flying and hadn't prevented him from plunging the plane into the ground. Such cases only add fuel to the fire of numerous jokes about useless and perpetually sleeping co-pilots, which is of course extremely unfair. One of the most prominent pieces of evidence against such jokes is the incident known as the Ghost Plane, where a Soviet Antonov An-12 circled over a city for several hours with an entirely unconscious crew. Only by a fortunate coincidence and a skillful co-pilot did this incident have a happy ending. Maybe not a completely happy ending, but rather a mostly happy ending, but I don't want to spoil it for you. I have made a video about this incredible incident, which you can watch on my streaming service Nebula. By the way, that's where you can find my other exclusive videos, like the episode on the Russian art of military cheating, when Nikita Khrushchev was deceived about the Soviet nuclear-powered submarine capabilities, or the hilarious episode of the military cheating on anti-aircraft tank firing test. And more episodes are coming soon. Just a little heads up, the next Nebula episode will be a hilarious story about a MiG-21 pilot and his amusing navigational error. But Nebula is not just home to my content, but also dozens of other unique exclusive projects from 200 other independent thoughtful creators like Red Atoms by Real Time History, Underexposed by Neo, or Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore. The reason for this constantly increasing number of exclusive top-quality videos is that Nebula is a totally different platform without a YouTube-like algorithm and without any ads, so creators on Nebula make their videos not in accordance with advertiser-friendly guidelines, but based on their most ambitious and crazy ideas, which altogether results in amazing videos whose number is growing every day. Along with access to exceptional educational content, you also get free access to Nebula classes, where you can take classes from your favorite creators and learn how to become a successful creator yourself. And best of all, if you sign up by clicking the link in the description, you will receive an insane 40% discount for an annual subscription, which means it will only cost you $250 a month for all this awesome exclusive content from Paper Skies and hundreds of other independent creators. This is the absolute best way to support Paper Skies and enjoy premium content. Thank you so much for watching.